Welcome to the third in my series of overviews of locomotives in my collection. In this episode, I will be reviewing the LMS and BR Standard Class 4 264 tank engines as designed by Fowler, Stanier, Fairburn and Retooled, and modelled by Hornby, Bachmann and Wrenn. In terms of numbers built, excellence of design, general utility and usefulness, I rank these engines alongside that of the Black 5 and 8F, and yet for all that, they have never, in my opinion, achieved the recognition and reputation they deserve. The numbers built speak for themselves. 125 of the Fowler variety, 206 of the Stanier 2-cylinder variety, 37 of the Stanier 3-cylinder variety for the London, Tilbury and Southend line, and 277 of the Fairburn, giving a total of 645 for the LMS designed 264 tanks. And if we add in the 155 of the BR Standard variant, the grand total comes to 800, being built over a period of 30 years from 1927 to 1957. Fast outer suburban commuter trains were their stock in trade, duties they performed right up until the end of 1967, less than 1 year before the end of steam. I well recall seeing the Stanier and Fairburn varieties speeding across the Wirral on the final leg of the Paddington to Birkenhead expresses between Chester and Woodside. Speeds of 90 miles an hour were not uncommon on the Liverpool Central to Manchester Central expresses in the 1950s, and the fates of the Stanier 3-cylinder variety on heavy commuter haulage on the London, Tilbury and Southend Railway became legendary. They were reputed to be able to accelerate faster than the electric trains of the day. These tank engines were also entrusted to the lesser demanding but equally important regional connecting trains, Southport to Liverpool Lime Street to connect with the London Euston Express, and similarly with towns in Yorkshire, notably Huddersfield and Bradford to Leeds, to connect with expresses to King's Cross. All right up until the end of 1967. Unlike today, the passengers in these connecting services did not have to leave their seats. The coaches were simply added to the main expresses. Can't do that on today's railways. In addition to these important duties, they handled a wide range of miscellaneous traffic: local passenger, banking, notably on Sharp, piloting, heavy expresses, even deputising for failed locomotives, station pilot duties, parcels traffic. They could be seen on freight traffic, but not to any great extent. They did not possess enough braking power for the norm of the day, the loose-coupled, unbraked freight train, the dead weight of a tender providing the additional braking to work these sorts of trains. In terms of preservation, there are two of the Fairburn variety based on the Lakeside and Haverthwaite Railway. Only in recent years have they ventured out of the Lake District. At least one had a spell on the Great Central. The National Railway Museum has the first of the London Tilbury 3-cylinder Stanier variety. There are no Stanier 2-cylinder examples preserved, and none of the original Fowler version, the last of which was withdrawn in 1966. The BR Standard version fared much better. 14 were rescued from Barry, and nor have these engines fared at all well in historical literature. To date, there's no the book of that excellent series from Irwell Press detailing the historical record of a class, nor the power of a series from Ian Allen Publications giving a general pictorial record of their work on the railway. In my opinion, a relatively neglected oversight of a class of locomotives as every bit as good and successful as the Black 5 or 8F and their more illustrious counterparts. With that background, I'll now have a look at the individual models that have been made, well, over quite a long period of time actually, because I think the first Hornby 001 came out 51-52. But anyway, we'll get to that later. First off is the Hornby Fowler 264, which came out in the early 1980s. This particular model is in a very smart LMS maroon livery, nicely lined out, and I have to say, yeah, it's a very, very good model, especially for the time. It captures the bulk of the engine, that look, quite a sleek, handsome look, very well indeed. Yeah, I suppose we can pick out a few pointers with the slightly overscale valve gear and everything, but the scale of the wheels, the spacing of the wheels appears to be correct, and overall it's a very, very fine looking locomotive. Slight downside with it that I notice is if you look at the front above the pony truck and in front of the cylinders, the buffer beam and footplate there seems to bend upwards slightly, and that appears to be a problem with these Margate produced ones. I don't know whether it's a batch issue or whether it was prevalent on them all, but that's a slight sort of thing just to take note of on this model. Otherwise, it's quite a splendid looking machine. Moving on, here is the Fowler 264, again in LMS, but LMS black, nicely lined out. Again, if you can notice, the front buffer beam footplate area is slightly angled upwards, which detracts a little bit from its overall appearance, but generally these are lovely looking locomotives for their time. Just looking inside the cab, there seems to be like an enclosure or an area which is sort of boxed off inside. I don't know what that's all about. Probably something to do with the casting and moulding of the cab and windows and boiler backplate, firebox backplate or whatever. So, you know, an area which should look open looks slightly enclosed with something. But anyway, still a pretty good looking locomotive in my book. Moving on from that, we get up to the early 2000s, and this is a retooled China produced version of the Fowler 264, again in LMS livery, and immediately I think you can see there's an improvement in the overall look of the locomotive. The most significant things is the wheels. The flanges are smaller, and it looks to be an altogether finer representation of the wheels and some of the details around there. You can see there's an exhaust injector underneath the cab just there, and the valve gear is a lot more finely produced. Again, a very fine looking locomotive. I think there's actually a cab roof sliding door that opens and closes, and again there's nothing boxing off inside the cab, which detracts from the original manifestation of that model. And you've got beautifully produced handrails there. There's actual cab detail on the back of the firebox boilerplate. I don't think you can see it here quite very clearly. But again, if you just sort of peering into that cab, you could almost have a game of football inside there, the room it's got. My only quibble with this, and it's a very minor quibble, is that it's not the latter batch of these locomotives that were produced under the Stanier regime, where there was a side windows on the cab and a different door space, and also that final batch were fully riveted. The models here that Hornby have are of the how do we call it, the unriveted ones. There is a name for it, it'll probably come back to me a bit later. Yes, well, now I guess the reason for that is that it would have involved Hornby with some major retooling to actually sort of do that, because in all honesty I don't think they've had to do very much with the tooling. They've obviously tweaked it, both the chassis and the locomotive body. Well, who can blame them really? It was one way of getting a new model out, upgraded fairly quickly, I suppose, without having to go to any great expenditure. Right, the name I'm thinking of, yeah, is the side tanks and the bunkers are welded. That's the word I was looking for. Whereas opposed the Stanier batch of these with the side window cab were riveted. But there we go. A fine looking locomotive. I think they resolved the issue with the raised up buffer beam as well, and foot plating above the pony wheel there. Now this next one is back to the 1980s, and this indeed is the very first one I got, and I've actually undertaken some modifications to it myself. The first thing I noticed about this was the lack of lining on the foot plating, and the number on the bunker was stamped on in white, and I thought this just doesn't look right. So I blackened the numbers out. I retained the numbers, the same number, because I didn't want to be faffing about with the number on the smoke box if I could avoid it. And I think these are Fox transfers. So the existing numbers were just blacked out, and then the application of these transfers over it in cream, which does actually make a difference to the way the locomotive looks, because it was quite significant when you saw these back in the day, that the numbers stood out in a cream colour. Lining is nicely done. I've actually added boiler bands, lining on the cylinders, and the lining, if we can get this right, yeah, along the foot plating here. Which makes a big difference to the overall appearance of the locomotive. Also painted the buffer beam red, a very vibrant colour that stands out from the general sort of red that they applied back in the factory. I've also put vacuum brake pipes on it, and a screw coupling and hook. Don't know if you can see it better on the back, but again it just gives a lift. And of course, with it being a late BR version, the electrification flashes. This model didn't come with the power classification, that's on there, 4P, and there you can see the electrification flashes. So some finishing details on it, which I think does actually give the locomotive quite a lift. Moving on to the next Fowler 264, we have the China version, again like that previous LMS version, only in BR colours. And there you can actually compare the lining between the current version and the previous incarnation of this model. And what I like about this is that the lining is even better again. Nothing wrong with it on the earlier model, I really wouldn't complain. But if you look at this one, the lining is inset from the tank a lot more. And when you consult any photographs, not that there are many photographs of these engines, you will see that the lining is inset quite a bit. And if you look at the curves, there's much more definition, they're more sharply defined. And of course they put the lining on the foot plating as well, so that saved a job. This one also has got outside steam pipes, which later batches of these engines had. If you look at the earlier batches, it's not a Hornby omission, it's the fact that they were actually turned out like that initially in the LMS days. Some of them might have actually acquired outside steam pipes as they went through the works. I can't be sure on that, but certainly later batches had the outside steam pipes. Also, you've got on this, on the top of the tank there, the vent. Now, the vent has been moved in so that it doesn't obstruct vision here, whereas if you look on the earlier locomotives, it's there quite prominent and probably had the effect of obscuring some of the vision. So that's been taken into account on this model. It already comes with vacuum pipes and hooks on it. I'm not sure I've got the hooks on this one, the coupling hooks, but anyway, there we go. Moving on again, we've got the Stanier 2-cylinder version, and this is an absolute stunner. I just love the way the wheels, the driving wheels, seem to half disappear up into the tanks. This gives it a very sleek, modern look. And this one is you can see that from the side tanks they're riveted. Beautiful representation of the valve gear. Again, the same wheelbase as the Fowler engines, 8 foot and 8'6". We'll talk about that a bit later because that was revised. If you go to the National Railway Museum, you can see the 3-cylinder version of this locomotive. And one of the things I want to emphasize about these engines, they are massive. They are seriously big engines, and you will discover that when you get close up and personal to 2500, which is the 3-cylinder version. Now they're virtually identical to these. The look and everything is very much the same, the spacing of the wheels. The main difference is in the 3-cylinder engines, the slide bars are rabbit's ear. They're Swindon rabbit's ear style slide bars, very much like on the very first 2 Princess locomotives. Apparently the LMS was in discussions with Southend Borough Council, I think, about the electrification of the line, but when they look at the costs, they withdrew their intention to proceed with any sort of studies about it because of the costs involved. But such was the demand for improved rail services that one of Stanier's first designs was to get out a tank engine to, sort out the motive power situation on that line. And they built the 3-cylinder. They built them with 3 cylinders. And if you read the literature on this, they talk about it. Well, it would improve the acceleration. Now that may or may not be the case, but one of the it was mooted that the Fowler 264 could work those trains, but apparently the civil engineer said that they were too heavy. Now they came in at something like 86 tons. Now the 3-cylinder version, which looked like this, came in at a whopping 92 tons. So it wasn't the weight. The 3-cylinder delivered far less hammer blow on the track, and I think that was a deciding factor. So yes, they could accelerate the trains, but it was more to do with hammer blow on the track, and that got it past the civil engineer. We sometimes forget that civil engineers impose quite severe restrictions on what chief mechanical engineers could produce in terms of size and weight and things. Stanier, before he took up appointment on the LMS, demanded from the directors that he would have a much freer rein than the previous incumbents of the mechanical engineering department of the LMS. So it looks like he got his way with this. But these engines performed terrifically well right up until 1962, when the line was electrified. And then they went on to build over 200 of the 2-cylinder type, which were found to be just as good, and this is what's represented here. And here we have the BR version, early BR. Again, you can see the riveting on this. What a sleek, magnificent looking locomotive that is. Same again. This one is a later BR version, and again this has got the welded variety, the welded side tanks, unlike the rivets that you can see on here. And I'll just point out a few things. If you just look at the design of that cab, the way that is chamfered there, and look at the size of the bunker and the way the cab is curved round, and little details here, the little curve on that. These were all built at Derby, or most of them were built at Derby, where the Fowler engines had originated. I think some might have come from North British as well. But again, you get the sense of massive proportions with these engines. But beautiful design. Moving on, we've got the Fairburn tank. Now 277 of these were built. 1940s, early 40s, the LMS operating authorities were demanding more of these, the Stanier type. That was deferred until 1944, by which time Fairburn was in charge, and he undertook a redesign, a re-evaluation of the design, to make it more, to have a greater utility and a greater route availability.